Anselm's ontological argument. Ontological arguments are a priori. This means that they're based on reason or logic rather than sense experience and observation. The great thing about a priori arguments is that if they're good, they can offer guaranteed proof or certainty. This is much better than an a posteriori argument, which can only tell us what is likely. A good a priori argument is called a sound argument. It will have true premises and will be logically valid. Ontological arguments claim that God's existence is self-evident because existence is essential to the definition of God. In the Proslogion, written in 1078, Anselm of Canterbury provides two ontological arguments to demonstrate a rational basis for believing in God. He calls this faith-seeking understanding, which is often interpreted as aiming to provide rational support for theists rather than a proof against atheists. However, given its a priori nature, we would expect this argument to be able to convince anyone. Anselm says the non-existence of that than which a greater cannot be conceived is inconceivable. In other words, it's impossible to properly conceive of a God who doesn't exist. He argues that God doesn't exist is a logical contradiction. So when the atheist, or the fool, as Anselm calls him, says in his heart, "There is no God," he is contradicting himself. Anselm says, why then did the fool say in his heart, "God is not," since it is so obvious to the rational mind that you exist supremely above all things? In the Proslogion chapter 2, Anselm sets out his first version of this argument. He starts off with the premise that God is understood as that than which nothing greater can be thought. Sometimes this is translated as conceived, and we can shorten this to TTWN-GCBC, the greatest conceivable being. And, he argues, whatever is understood exists in the understanding. Then he goes on to argue that it is greater to exist in reality than in the understanding only. Logic leads us to conclude that God must therefore exist in reality. Otherwise, God could not be the greatest conceivable being, as a greater being could be conceived, i.e., one that exists both in the understanding and in reality. Anselm argues obviously this is impossible due to the definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Assuming the opposition's position and showing how it leads to absurdity or a contradiction like this is called reductio ad absurdum. Anselm supports his claim that whatever is understood exists in the understanding using the analogy of a painter. A painter might have a certain image in mind before realising it on the canvas. Before the painting, it is only in the mind. After the painting, it is both in the mind and on the canvas. He says, when a painter first conceives of what he will afterwards perform, he has it in his understanding. After he has made the painting, he both has it in his understanding and he understands that it exists because he has made it.
This video has been brought to you by Jest Education. Subscribe for part 2.